Welcome to Marine Conservation League's Climate Action Working Group meeting. And for January, I'm Bob Miller. I'm here with my co-chair, Ken Strong, and we're members of the Marine Conservation League Board. For nearly 90 years, Marine Conservation League's mission has been to preserve, protect, and enhance the natural aspects.
I would just add, those of you who are not here in person are missing out on coffee and donut holes.
So that's our mission, preserve, protect, and enhance natural assets of marine. We're doing it in a changing environment. So to help meet Marine Conservation mission, the Climate Action Working Group advocates for faster greenhouse gas emissions reduction and for carbon removal. And for innovative emerging technologies and policies to slow climate change that's so damaging to natural assets in marine and natural assets everywhere. It's also the single biggest health threat to humanity. The climate change accentuated wildfires in Los Angeles is simply the latest of many examples. We advocate with elected and agency decision makers and their staff in local and countywide jurisdictions and agencies. We advocate in regional agencies, especially MC Clean Energy, and with state representatives, including Damon Connolly, Mike McGuire, and with Jared Huffman at the national level. Other Marine Conservation League committees, Parks and Open Space, and Land Use, Transportation, and Water, advocate for a wide range of environmental issues, and they complement our work by advocating for climate change adaptation in areas like transportation, water use, sea level rise, and more. I chair another effort of active climate action working group members to help develop and advocate for innovative positions that accelerate greenhouse gas reduction. We want others to join us in doing just that. And if you're interested, contact me at robertmiller454@gmail.com. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that your support enables us to continue to do our advocacy work. And so a bunch of you are members. If you're not yet a member, you can join at marineconservationleague.org/donate. At this meeting, we'll hear reports on a carbon border tax and cap and trade. Now, even for some of those who are here, it's hard to figure out how this fits into our overall advocacy work. So, as I've indicated in the past, in its greenhouse gas reduction work, Marine Conservation League advocates in 3 priority areas: electrify buildings and vehicles, decarbonize the grid, and remove carbon from the atmosphere, focusing on natural solutions. Now, at least 5 major kinds of policies can help decarbonize the grid, the second advocacy area. And one of them is putting a price on carbon, or carbon pricing. And carbon border tax and cap and trade are different types of carbon pricing. Taxing fossil fuels makes them more expensive, and it leads to less use, and that helps decarbonize the grid. And taxing fossil fuels can also help with electrification. So in a moment, I'm going to turn things over to my co-chair, Ken Strong. But first, some housekeeping for folks who are on Zoom. First, please keep yourself on mute and put your questions in chat. That really helps us on this end sort of sifting and sorting these questions together. Know that we're recording this meeting, and likely the meeting will be available on our YouTube channel. And please consider attending in person, congenial environment, allows for more interaction among the attendees. And we've already heard that your folks on Zoom are missing out on the famous or infamous donut hole. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Ken.
Thanks, Bob. I just have a couple of quick comments. As Bob indicated, we're hearing about a couple of different economic policies which can address the cost of carbon. And one of them at a national level and international level that Bob Archer is going to talk to us about, followed by a discussion of the California Cap and Trade program and its anticipated reauthorization in the near future and what that may mean for monies available for some California programs, as well as efforts to reduce the use of carbon in this state. So our first speaker is going to be Bob Archer, and he, trained economist, experienced overseas in developing energy systems. Bob will tell you more about his background in that regard. But the way we're going to structure the meeting is that Bob's going to talk about a couple of different different topics that lead us into what carbon border tariff tax. I'm not sure what word we're using exactly today. How we get there. At one point, Bob will indicate we're going to take some questions for about up to 5 minutes to kind of deal with the technical aspects of what's a little bit of a wonky topic. And then we will get into, Bob will get into some specific policy and politics aspects of this. So with that, Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I'm going to share screen for you at this point.
Thank you. Good morning. As background, I just wanted to mention I studied economics at Yale, was in the Peace Corps in Columbia, and I spent 25 years working on electricity sector reforms and privatization and regulatory development in Central and Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, South and Southeast Asia. And I came away with that, something that really influenced my thinking about the approach on climate policy is that the experience of dealing with weak institutions and serious corruption in emerging economies. So my findings here are based on the research of others, that the Inflation Reduction Act and the Paris Agreement won't really get us where we need to get to. And I did a presentation similar to this in May, a joint presentation with William Nordhaus, the Nobel economist, whose work forms a foundation of this whole concept of the carbon border adjustment and climate club, which I will discuss. So I'll start with this basic fact. The task is global, not local, regional, or national. And I want to read this, that billions of individuals, millions of firms, thousands of governments, and hundreds of nations, and for them to take action, they're going to have incentives. We can raise the price of goods and services that are carbon intensive and lower the ones that are less carbon intensive. This is not adequately reflected in climate policy formation. We lack a systemic national and international approach, and we need a national action that incentivizes other nations to act and invest. Now, I'm going to address 4 elements here, the global and US circumstances that call for a different approach. And in proposed US path forward, a carbon fee, rebate, and carbon border tariff. I emphasize that last one. Circumstances now call for giving priority to the third leg of the policy, the carbon border tariff. And I'll address the politics as well. For context, the 3 main policy approaches many of us are familiar with. The first is the Inflation Reduction Act. It's subsidies-based. But I'm going to focus on the 3-part policy in red and why it is necessary. Just in summary, this is the carbon fee. It's on coal oil and gas, with revenues recycled into a household rebate to protect households and a carbon border tariff to maintain U.S. industry competitiveness. This policy addresses two main constituencies, households and industry. Note that there is no carbon market involved in this process. So I'm going to go through 4 points to describe the global picture. Key point number 1, emerging economies now account for greater than 60% of emissions of carbon dioxide emissions. In developed economies, that includes us, the EU, UK, Canada, Japan, Australia, and South Korea, are around 28%. In the US, around 13%. So emerging economies are the focus, including of this presentation. So the basic messages here are: the problem is global, the current efforts are inadequate, and focusing on the US is myopic and insufficient. That's too far. Back up one, yeah. When I mention emerging economies, here are the 21 that account for greater than 60% of the global carbon pollution. In China, South and Southeast Asia, major exporting economies are predominant. Point number 2, the current international treaty, the Paris Climate Agreement, is inadequate and inherently flawed. It's a voluntary process. Country commitments are not legally binding. There's no enforcement or penalty for failure to meet them. Accountability through peer pressure or ambition won't get us there. The second point on this issue is that the Paris Agreement cannot overcome the problem of free rider countries. These are countries that benefit from the pollution reduction efforts of other countries, but do not take part in the effort or costs. They are free riders. Finally, the UN as a climate program implementer is not a serious option. The historical experience is poor. Point number 3, fossil energy is effectively subsidized annually around $7 trillion globally. This is an IMF calculation annually, but probably not how many think. See the low gray area on this chart. This shows that only 10% are what you can call direct subsidies, such as tax breaks for depreciation allowances for our oil industry. 90% are indirect subsidies, the blue area on this chart. This is the carbon pollution cost that falls on us in the form of climate and health damages. Not on the fossil fuel companies. They pollute for free, and these costs are not included in the fossil energy prices. And this indirect subsidy can be remedied by a carbon tax, which puts the cost back where it belongs, on the fossil industries producing the pollution. Now, in the US, these direct subsidies are about $20 to $40 billion. But the indirect subsidies, the lack of a carbon tax, are $660 billion. So when you're talking with those who say they want to remove the subsidies in the US on fossil energy, ask if they support a carbon tax. Now, point 4, weak legal, regulatory, and investment environments inhibit investment in emerging economies. The risk is too high, particularly for private investment, both international and domestic. We need reform at the country, the energy sector, and the clean energy project level. This is a major problem, basically unaddressed in the international climate dialogue. The current focus is on creating funds for transfers from developed to emerging economies, and this hasn't and won't work sufficiently. These financing needs that I referenced here are huge. We need a 3 to 4-fold increase in overall clean energy investment by 2032 and a 6 to 7-fold increase in private investment. So in summary, global emissions are rising, and that's coming from emerging economies, many of which are major exporters. The US Paris Agreement is inherently flawed. Fossil fuel subsidies is an ongoing market failure, and clean energy financing is really low and needs reform. So our national approach must link outside our borders, particularly with emerging economies, to succeed globally. A current approach won't get us there. So let's look at the current US picture and where we've been. We have a 30-year history of legislation for clean energy subsidies, regulations, and standards, basically a supply side approach. US emissions began declining in 2008 due mostly to economic and market changes. The economic recessions, of course, in 2008, the financial recession and COVID. And secondly, cheap natural gas very significantly displaced coal generation. Third, globalization. We sent our dirty industries to Mexico, Brazil, China, and elsewhere. Fourth, economies like ours generally have 1 to 1.5% improvement in reduction of carbon intensity. And fifth, the subsidy approach had a significant impact on reducing wind and solar generation costs, including those in China. Now, Senator Whitehouse, Democrat of Rhode Island, is our leading Senate climate advocate. And here's his take on the administration's subsidy approach. Can you play that?
To move from fossil fuels to clean energy. But we know from everybody who's looked at it, including this recent report, that on its own, it does not get us onto that pathway to climate safety. So good step, but clearly not sufficient.
Now, let's look at the Inflation Reduction Act, which will spend $500 billion by 2032. And I put at the top of this slide the emerging economies. The IRA is not replicable in these economies. There's no fiscal space, according to the International Monetary Fund. And reports are that it is drawing investment away from the emerging economies into Europe and the US. Now, I want to read a direct quote from the IMF. The US and Europe have embraced large-scale policies to subsidize clean energy, but this option is not open to emerging economies, given their lack of fiscal space. They don't have the budget. They don't have the money. That said, both country groups should pay attention to the revenue side, in particular, higher taxation of energy with carbon taxes. Now, IRA in terms of climate is a good step, as the senator said, not sufficient, maybe around 10% reductions. Policy-wise, it's more the same subsidies. Politically, it was all Democrats. In terms of equity, it disproportionately benefits high-income households. The administrative impact is very significant. It's still being rolled out. And the coverage is predominantly power sector and transportation focused. So let's take a look at the equity issue on the IRA. Here's a chart that shows the reduction in average taxes forecast from climate tax provisions of the IRA in the year 2027. Jason Furman, Harvard, Obama's former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, ran the numbers. What he found was that the tax benefits fall overwhelmingly to the top 1%. The energy industry, basically, financiers, project developers, and the like. So here you see that it fell to the right on that chart. The blue line is basically is entirely the investment tax credits for clean energy. The bottom 80% of households will receive from $0 to $200 a year tax break. Now, the dirty little secret is that historically and currently many subsidy policies have been regressive. Most benefits accrue to higher income households and costs fall disproportionately on lower income households. This is Severin Bornstein's and Lucas Davis's University of California research recently updated. Now, a word on the California approach. California is a mismatch. California policy approach is a mismatch for emerging economies. California is wealthy, has low corruption, high administrative capacity, and public support for environmental climate policies. Its complex, expensive, inequitable policies are a poor fit for emerging economies where you have serious corruption and weak institutions. So the US summary, the IRA subsidy approach is a good step, but not sufficient. There are inequities and it's expensive. Fossil subsidies are unchanged and emerging economies are really not incentivized to act. So we need a phase 2 systemic policy that connects globally. Now, the next section here, part 3, I want to get into the policies that need to come forward. And the good news is the carbon border tariff is coming from the European Union. It's probably one of the most significant, if not the most significant climate policies that will be coming at us about 1 year from now, regardless of this administration. So we want to look at that and how it gets to a climate club and also a carbon fee and rebate. So that's what I'm going to focus on, the carbon border tariff and climate club. I will not address the bottom 3 for lack of time, which are also very critical. But I want to clarify right here, when we talk about a traditional tariff, the Trump and Biden tariffs are effectively a tax at the border on goods imported to the US, like aluminum and steel. For example, a 10% tariff levied on aluminum is based on the cost of the imported good. So that's your tariff, traditional tariff. Now, a carbon border tariff is placed not on the product cost, but on the carbon content of the imported product. It discourages the import of dirty carbon-intensive products from China and other dirty manufacturing countries. And the EU will start this in January 2026, less than a year from now, which they call a CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's going to apply to aluminum, steel, iron, cement, and fertilizers. This tariff will be based upon the carbon price that they have in Europe under cap and trade. And so exporters are going from US and elsewhere are going to have to pay that going forward. So here's Senator Whitehouse on what it takes.
Came out today, I think, pretty compelling, and it's supported by other similar reports that it really takes carbon pricing to get to a pathway to climate safety.
Okay, let's move on to the first element here. Let's see, do you hit that, Ken, to make them show up?
Yes.
Yeah. So the first point, why do you put a carbon fee on? When I talk about that, I'm talking about something like $15 a ton that steadily increases over time. You want to decimate demand. And what that does is it accelerates the clean energy alternatives penetration into the market. It's the best fit for emerging economies because it is simple, transparent, effective, and equitable. And third, the price certainty you get from that trajectory is really important for innovation.
Oops. My bad.
Next one. Yeah, the price certainty is really important. Gives you your innovation investment certainty and avoids political blowback by starting early and low and moving up. And then upstream, it's imposed at the well, the mine, and import, not on hundreds of thousands of gas pumps and stores and everything else. And it's very easily administered by Treasury and the IRS. So the decimation of demand is really critical to what we're trying to achieve. Now, as long as there's demand, okay,
I'm trying.
okay. As long as there's demand for oil and gas, oil companies are going to meet it. That's from the head of the United Arab Emirates Oil and Gas Company, and who's head of the COP28 in Dubai. We can't expect oil companies to phase themselves down. Driving down demand with a carbon fee must happen eventually. Now, this is a very important recent analysis of 1,600 policies around the world by the German Potsdam Institute and others, which found that only 63 had significant impact, those with a carbon price. So I'm going to read this directly. The key ingredient, if you want to reduce emissions, is that you have pricing in the policy mix. If subsidies and regulations come alone or in a mix with each other, that's the IRA, you won't see major emission reductions. But when price instruments come in the mix, like a carbon energy tax, then they will deliver those substantial emission reductions. Now, one of the things that they cited was the United Kingdom example, where they imposed a carbon tax. Go ahead, Ken, you can. On top of the weak EU cap and trade price at that time. It priced three prices, started at 2013 and rose up to $24 with it. There's about a $30 a ton carbon price. And the result was 85% decline in coal use for power generation. This was applied specifically to power generation. Now, the very important here is what are people's concerns and perceptions on this. So these first three that you see here are all addressed. The personal costs are too high, impacts low-income households, mistrust about the government on use of the funds. If you have a rebate of the revenues from the carbon tax, all these three are addressed by it. And the fourth one is basically an issue of education and advocacy and correcting false narratives that are abound. Now, next slide is, I want to discuss briefly carbon tax and cap and trade. Why a carbon tax? Cap and trade experience has revealed problematic characteristics, fortunately not found in the carbon tax policy. I won't go into detail here, but the summaries. Cap setting. When you use the cap setting process of modeling, it's likely going to be inaccurate with the wrong number of allowances coming up. Economic swings adversely impact cap and trade. Technological change undermines cap and trade. And the complementary, as they're called, clean energy programs actually can counteract cap and trade. And carbon offsets undermine real emission reductions. That's Barbara Hyatt at Berkeley. Is a market-based. Over time, it has become more and more government administratively controlled. And as I mentioned before, the emerging economies, cap and trade is a poor fit. And just a word on voluntary carbon offsets. This is basically a get out of jail free card for major polluters. It's the worst climate policy with 25 years of deeply flawed experience. 60 to 90% of voluntary offsets do not reduce emissions, but numerous studies have documented that. The incentives are misaligned. Everyone involved in the voluntary offset process benefits and the climate loses, and the problems are inherent to the design. Now, let's move on to the second policy, the revenue recycling from the carbon fee. We're going to come into a household rebate and how you do that. So the rebate is equitable. And why do you want to use it? It provides long-term political durability. People will like it and lobby for a continued tax. With a tax of $15, rising $10 a year, a family of four would receive about $2,000 in year 4 and $3,450 in year 10. How equitable is it? With all the households receiving essentially the same level of rebate, the Treasury Department analysis showed the bottom 70% of households come out ahead. Their rebate exceeds the increased cost of energy and products. It's important to note that products constitute 2/3 of the increased costs based on this carbon fee. Gasoline is only about 6% of household income costs, household budgets. So the lower the income, the greater the benefit, as you can see here. So compare this to what I showed you previously about the IRA and the equity of the tax credits that take place. Now, on to the third leg, which is the carbon border tariff. This can get complicated, but it is a must-have feature to succeed on a global basis. Look at it from the perspective of a European industry. Go ahead and put those up. Boy, this is not showing.
That's all right.
The carbon price, if you're sitting as an owner of a cement plant, the carbon price adds cost to your European firm. And foreign competitors in Brazil, without a tax, have an advantage. You may be tempted as a European company to move overseas where there's no carbon price. That's called leakage. So a carbon border tariff maintains competitiveness, avoids leakage, incentivizes other countries to establish a carbon price. In sum, this carbon border tariff achieves 3 objectives. It levels the playing field, incentivizes others to establish their own carbon price, and leads to global carbon pricing harmonization. Now, as I said, this is coming. The Europeans will start this January 1st, 2026. They spent 2 years gathering data, preparing for this. They're going to impose this price on the carbon content of imports, iron, steel, aluminum, fertilizer, and cement. So industries from countries without a carbon price are subject to this EU border carbon tariff. That's us, US, it's China, Brazil. Not all industries are the same in every country. Carbon dirty industries are going to be heavily impacted. That's China, for example, where their industry intensity of carbon is about 2.8 times greater than the US industry. So the US industries may benefit from this. And if you have a carbon price, like Canada, equivalent or greater than the European carbon price, you're not subject to this. So, what should we do? And why should we do this? The reason is we want to maintain US competitiveness and avoid industry moving and potentially gain markets. You want to make industries from non-pricing countries pay for their dirty exports. You want to incentivize countries to establish their carbon fee so they can get out from under this. This can lead to harmonizing global carbon prices and declining emissions. So let's stop there for a few minutes. Ask for any clarifications, questions that you may have on the carbon fee, recycling the money into the rebate, and the carbon border tariff that is coming at us before we move on to where this can lead globally into a climate club, and then the politics of it as we face it in this year coming. Any questions, comments?
Now, we're gonna talk about the politics and the policy after, and the politics in particular afterwards. So I think the real question is how this works. So you talked about this as being, the rebate part of it anyway, as being uniform. So how would this work?
We've learned from Canada how to do it, and that's pretty straightforward. You want to put a check in the mail monthly or quarterly. You can start with the concept that all the revenues from the carbon tax go into the black box and out the same month to every household. Politically, pragmatically, some of those funds will probably be used for other purposes, although the rationale for doing that has pretty well disappeared, given $500 billion or $1 trillion now under the Inflation Reduction Act being available. So it's time to move revenues to households. A direct check in the mail. Canada started out with an obscure tax credit buried somewhere in the tax forms, which generated no public awareness of the benefits of having a carbon tax in Canada. Then they changed the name to something incomprehensible. And finally, on the third try, they're sending checks in quarterly. And the failure in Canada to make it clear in their messaging how this dividend, the rebate from the carbon tax, which 90% of the money of that carbon tax went back to households. To make it clear, that's where it came from, and that it exceeded considerably the increased cost of products and gasoline, for example. So the messaging of the Liberal government in Canada was very weak. And that is a constant issue, I think, in our politics as well, to message the good things that are being done and what the rationale is for doing.
Pam had sent something in chat earlier about the volume on the owl. Has that been fit? Is that okay now, or do I need to try and do something? I'm sorry I didn't notice this earlier. Everybody hearing this okay? All right. David Muller has a question. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. And Robert, thanks for doing this presentation. This is all very interesting and brought together in a way more comprehensive manner than I've ever heard it before. So thank you. But I have one quick question here, and I might not have this quite right, but it seems like to get this going, this border tariff concept, you need a big enough market that other countries want to sell into to kind of get it all going. It sounds like that's going to be the EU, and I think you said that it starts for the EU January 1st, 26. So my question is this. Do I have that part right? It takes a big market that people want to sell into to get this going. And what's the risk that through other pressures, the EU backs away from doing this?
You put your finger on and what I'm going to speak to directly.
So the policy part, save that, or the politics, save that part, because we'll
Yeah,
talk about that.
Okay.
I'll say that, but your point, you made a very important point. The market needs to be large. The European market is very large.
Yeah.
South Asian, Southeast Asia, Chinese exporters to Europe are been very, very concerned about this. For a year and a half, 2 years, the media, the newspapers, India is complaining, they're going to the World Trade Organization to ask for an opinion. The EU has done this with the World Trade Organization. They're big exporting countries. This issue has been virtually absent from the US economic media
Right.
and the climate environmental media. But the market size is a critical one. EU is a big one for Southeast Asian, so it's going to get off to a good start, but I'll address that subsequently in a few minutes.
Brian Tyrone had asked a question. If CBAM was instituted by the EU today, do you know how much the US would pay, US industry, I'm assuming, or how much US industries would benefit?
On the benefits side, Chinese exports to the EU are going to be paying a large border tariff because their steel, aluminum industries are quite dirty. The US benefit potentially, and some studies by the Climate Leadership Council indicate an increase in potential US exports if you join this whole process. The actual dollar amounts by industry type, I don't know. But it's steel, aluminum, iron, petrochemicals, cement, are the starting points. And this is the critical thing. And the EU will be expanding this. They're going to start it and implement it over a period of time here through full implementation in 2032. The Germans pushed it off because they didn't particularly like it. It will replace the free allowances that industry gets under cap and trade in Europe. And they all like those free allowances. California has the same system. So I don't know the answer in terms of the actual dollar amounts.
So, Bill, go ahead.
Will China join the club?
Eventually, I hope we'll get to that issue, but I don't know. They're going to be paying starting January 1st. Will they put on a carbon price equal to the European Union
Yes.
next year? The
Right.
answer is no. I
Okay,
can't
and
see that happening.
okay, and how would they if they did it, and why won't they do it?
How does it say again?
How would they avoid this tariff? And why wouldn't they do that fairly quickly?
Chinese politics and policies, I don't think that they could put it in place in a year, number one. Number two, the incentive will be there for them to do it. So that's the nature of it, Bill.
Yeah. So what you said is that if the countries subject to this tariff have a climate tax policy,
Correct,
they're not subject to it, is that right?
correct, Canada.
Okay, so that means that if everybody has a climate tax policy, there won't be any income for the EU for this policy, is that right?
At the border, correct.
Yeah,
And we will have then a global carbon price, which is where we want to get.
and so if you look at I missed it, but if you look at the countries out there that are going to be subject to it, what proportion of them have a tax or something like a tax? I don't know how you define the tax in another country. How big a job is that? I mean, are there a lot of countries that have to do this?
Yes, your exporting countries, you look at, focus on South and Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Because I'll get to it. Some of them are starting carbon pricing at $5 a ton of carbon pricing, et cetera. So it's very low, but the idea is there, it's getting there. And that's where you need to increase that.
So if it's $5 a ton or $15
It
a
needs
ton,
to get to maybe 30, and then 35 and 40.
Right, and will that make a difference in terms of your exemption from the European Union?
When they match up with the European price, then it all goes away for that country. You match the carbon price and the border carbon tariff process, then you're effectively a member of the club. The European Union itself and all those countries have agreed on a carbon price, cap and trade. They've agreed on the tariff issue. They are effectively a large climate club. Okay, any more questions?
Yeah, Bob, one last one and then we can move on.
Yeah.
So you talked about how this, the tariff goes on these certain basic industries.
Starting.
Starting with, so, and one of them was steel and there were some others. So if the Europeans are manufacturing, if the Europeans want to import a TV, for example. Now, TV may have aluminum or steel in it. But does the TV subject to it, or is it only if you actually import steel beams?
Steel beams, different kinds of steel. The simplicity and the data is reasonably there. They've collected it. The US has similar data. California has it, EPA. So the administration initially, starting with these 5 major products, is pretty straightforward. And you don't want to get into the little products like that.
So you don't have to figure out how much
Your big bang is
steel there is in the TV.
No.
Okay.
Big bang for the buck. You know what basically the Chinese steel manufacturing processes are and the carbon intensity. And they send it in, and if there's a disagreement, there's a resolution process.
Okay, let's move on then,
Okay.
assuming I can get this to share.
We want
Right.
to start talking about how do you get to the global action that we've just been discussing? What's the path to get to a startup, what I call a startup climate club? Go ahead.
I'm working on it. Better. Good.
Yeah, next one.
Okay.
What is a climate club? It's a cooperative, and see the word in red, binding approach among a few countries, starting with common carbon pricing and a carbon border tariff. Non-members have to pay that tariff. So they're incentivized to join by putting in place a carbon price, or they're going to lose some of their export markets to clean countries. So it's both a stick and a carrot. And it's open to all that have that common carbon price and tariff. And again, why do you want to do it? Because it benefits the good actors and penalizes the free riders, and it encourages the broader participation. It's not a closed operation, and it will reduce dirty global climate trade over time and spread carbon pricing within those countries, which has impact on the domestic production. It enhances clean industry competitiveness, and it leverages US economic power in terms of our trade and investment position. Now, next, how do you do this? Start small. A climate club of G7 countries, for example, that's the US, Canada, Japan, UK, Germany, France, Italy, and the EU, all have a carbon price except the US. Okay? So it's there, and the G7 has actually agreed in principle to a climate club, so it's understood that there can be a path forward in this way.
And it exempts the bottom 50 countries.
Yeah, that's very important, thank you. Because, you know, if you're in Gabon and you have to pay a tariff to get into Europe, not a good situation. Exempt the bottom 50 poorest countries for 5 or 10 years for political and equity purposes. So you have the G7 Climate Club, those 7 countries are 40 to 45% of global imports. And that gets at the question, how big is the market? And if you expand that to the major economies, you're at 75 to 80% of the global imports going on, and you have thereby met what you want to do is to get a global price, every country coming into some degree of harmonization in that. So they are incentivized to join that situation. So that's where I think you've got to get to incentivize those 21 countries in particular that are called emerging economies. That's what China characterizes itself as. And get the incentives on them to make those changes. So let's go on to what's always fun. Politics. First, before we get to that, I want to talk about false narratives that won't go away. The myths come from both ends of the political spectrum, including some of our favorites like Krugman, Friedman, and Leonhardt in the New York Times, David Roberts, Robinson Meyer, and academics Leah Stokes, Matto Mildenberger, David Victor, and Jesse Jenkins. All take part in some of this narrative that we have to deal with. First one, politically impossible. You put the cost on early, and the benefits are 20 years away. Political scientists will tell you that's a non-starter. And they get away with this because they only talk about the carbon tax up front. They never mention addressing the households with the rebate and addressing industry competitiveness with this carbon border adjustment. Hurts the poor, we know that's not the case again, and it doesn't work. And it's not a silver bullet, true, but that's not a reason to dismiss this. And from the right, to kill the economy, jobs, and innovation, that is readily rebutted and not an issue. Now, the support is there for this approach, and so is the opposition. So you find here support among the public, economists, Janet Yellen's initiative, Fortune 500 companies under the Climate Leadership Council, and a lot of international organizations. So how can the US respond? We need legislation. And there's been a lot of, not a lot, but good proposals in this last Congress. In the Democratic side, Senator Whitehouse in the lead, with House members Del Bene, Castor, and others on the Clean Competition Act, which has some carbon pricing in that bill. Then you have Republicans, Cassidy from Louisiana, Graham, South Carolina, and Kramer from North Dakota, all have put forward some kind of Foreign Pollution Fee Act type approach that is skittish about the issue of a tariff fee, a carbon fee included as part of that, which we really want to get. So there is bipartisan support broadly for this issue. And the time is now. The tax cut issue is going to be huge in 2025. Our budget deficit is 6%, which is really high. And as I said, the Europeans are coming at us at the end of this year. So here's Senator Whitehouse again on the politics.
This. For having to look like getting pretty much everybody on our side. You've got a lot of pricing curious folks on the Republican side, particularly with respect to responding to the CBAM. If you don't respond to the CBAM and you represent a district that has a big cement plant that ends up exporting to the EU, or a big chemical plant that ends up exporting to the EU, they're going to be coming into you and saying, hey, WTF, I'm paying all these tariffs now, and why do I need to do that? And then you have to say, well, you need to do that because I'm beholden to the fossil fuel industry and they want to pollute for free and not be charged for the cost of their pollution, so I'm going to have to let you be tariffed.
2 more slides. So what about the Republican Senate, Republican House, and Republican White House, the trifecta? What's the case to be made? The White House loves tariffs, particularly when it involves China. And this is effectively a clean air initiative. The carbon border tariff can be more targeted than across the board and have a deeper impact. US industry benefits are there potentially in taking over some export markets, and the China into Asia exporters oppose the EU tariff, it appears. So there can be a US and EU commonality there. And finally, a staged path to get there. Step one, you want to make sure that the EU and the UK proceed on January 1st of next year. And then step two, build a US coalition, making the point that it's good for the economy and industry. And step three, get that bipartisan law on the books. And eventually get the carbon fee and rebate into place as well, which is not likely under this administration. So this four-stage approach comes from a major Senate advocate. So that's the politics that we face going forward, driven by the European issue to a fair degree. So that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Bob. So questions, probably on the politics side of things as much as anything, since we talked about some of the other issues. Let me stop sharing.
Just as a footnote on the politics, we briefed Jared. He very much understands the consequences and potential in this whole approach. So he's fully versed.
Yeah, your name?
I'm Alan Edmondson, yeah.
That's right.
Is the EU's CBAM under attack and potentially will not proceed? I would imagine.
Now, where within Europe, it's in place 2 years, almost 2 years, year and a half, working on putting it together in preparation. The Asian exporting countries have been saying this is discriminatory, etc., without ever mentioning in the media that they can make it go away by putting their own carbon fee in place and a border tariff and join the club. India is going to the World Trade Organization asking for an opinion. They're going to get nowhere on it. So yes, countries that export to the EU are really concerned about it. Within the EU, do not see it. And the EU, I should say the United Kingdom plus the EU are both involved in this.
So, sort of the same question that Alan's asking, because from my perspective, the first thing that happens is Trump's going to announce a 25% across the board tariff on everything coming out of Europe if they don't rescind this stuff or something like that. So how does the politics of how solid is this in Europe at this point?
It's law.
Yeah.
It is in place and it is to take place. The degree to which US industry, significantly through the Climate Leadership Council, make their case with this administration that this is a better way than across the board tariffs to really hit countries like China, that will have an impact. And some early reports indicate that the administration is not going across the board, but will focus tariffs on steel, aluminum, and related subsets because of the fear of directly raising prices like they did with clothes washers that they put a tariff on China and Korea, as it turned out, and then driving prices up immediately. Bill.
Yes. The IRA was successful in being able to cut across the aisle because so many Republican states benefited from the investments that took place. And whether that's going to help protect the IRA distribution and continuation of the rebates is another question. Don't know about that, but it has been successful. So how will this policy have a foreseeable benefit? I mean, how do people, when they look at this, they think, oh God, more taxes. And how do you get over that? Because the one thing that the IRA did was to make it look positive. And it did turn out to be, even though that has its limitations.
The IRA was all Democrats to start. By the process, there were no Republicans voting for it. Many of the projects are in Republican areas. My observation is it didn't swing a whole lot of votes in November. We'll find out how it impacts Republican support going forward. In terms of tariffs are coming. So that's not an issue. It's going to be which kind of tariff. If you're going to have an across the board tariff on bottles and computers and cars, whatever, it's going to hit right into prices. If you target like this on the raw materials, it will be less impactful and take a little longer to get through the economic system. Bill.
Well, one detailed question in terms of the club, is Canada in it yet? Since they're being, already engaged by tariff threats. But then more globally, politically, in our legislature, how aggressive do you expect the Democrats who are favoring this to be in kind of getting out and trying to get out in front of the whole tariff discussion with this, this particular proposal?
I don't know the details of the Democratic strategy. Clearly, Sheldon Whitehouse is the key guy in the Senate, and he's been working with, and you saw in there some of the Coons, Senator Coons is a joint bill with Senator Kramer of North Dakota. So there's a lot of discussion. And the New York Times article indicated that the Climate Leadership Council has been directly involved in the data analysis. They've got 2 modeling groups doing this kind of work. So there's serious policy analysis going on to address the kind of question that Bill raised. And what's going to be the impact across the board versus targeted heavy, dirty industry approach.
And how about CCL and its outreach to, mobilize all of us to put pressure on?
I think it's CCL is going to be focused on the really kind of on the education information at this point. This is not easy to communicate.
Yeah.
And this is a real task ahead. And CCL is going to have a very significant effort in terms of maintaining the Inflation Reduction Act. It's an initial immediate issue, I think, coming up.
Yeah, Bob, I think you're.
I should clarify. I'm not speaking on behalf of CCL. This is my presentation and drawing a lot on their work as well as others.
I think your discussion of the phased approach is important because if you look forward to this year, so we're going to have some sort of a Republican reconciliation bill that's going to address tax issues. At the same time, we're going to have some tariffs put on by the administration. And yet neither of those by them as currently forecast are going to address the CBAM. So that's going to go, the European border adjustment tariff is going to go into effect January under, unless addressed in some fashion by the Congress.
Correct. Or it's unclear because Congress has effectively delegated a lot of tariff authority to the executive branch.
Yeah.
And so those are the things to watch for, that the European Union stays on track. And to the extent that the tariff discussions that take place, how they relate, if they do, to this. I mean, I'm just amazed at how little discussion has been in the US. I listened to a Brookings Institution session yesterday where 3 experts on China-US climate policy talked and trade and never mentioned the European initiative that's coming straight down the tracks. the awareness and treatment of this in the think tanks, universities, and environmental groups is zero.
You just said something that actually raises a question in my mind. We've all heard and read all these things about how under existing law, the Trump administration has pretty nearly carte blanche to impose whatever kind of cross the board or tariffs it wants to. It seems to have very broad tariff authority. From anything you've heard or read, could the Trump administration unilaterally impose a U.S. carbon border adjustment tariff such as to be part of the club?
I suspect they probably could. It's a tariff. Not based on cost, but based on another criterion, a carbon content. But ultimately, the issue is can you get a price in that bill as well that would satisfy the Europeans that you meet their price or trajectory to it.
Okay. Right.
So those are the things to watch for in 2025.
Bob, do you have a question? I think we need to wrap up this part of the program.
Yeah, so, you raised a lot of information that, very useful. You mentioned a couple of times how little was known about this in States. Among folks who should know more. It'd be helpful after this meeting to put, to send out a couple of links to information sources on this. And if you could include something on how they managed to pull this off in the EU, that would be really interesting, because you've got different countries that are going to be affected to different extent by this, and yet they did it. They pulled it off.
Because they had a carbon price and climate programs that cost industry, increasing the disadvantage they had with regard to Brazil and China and the others. And it became clear. And I think William Nordhaus had some over time dialogue with a lot of Europeans on how this would be a clean process to impact the world rather than just giving free allowances to their industry.
All right, well, thank you so much, Bob. That was very, as Bob said, a lot of information, very informative. It's something that I certainly didn't know very much about. So we're going to switch.
But let me just say, don't hesitate, anybody, to email me with questions or other comments. Appreciate it.
Okay, we're going to switch from the national realm to the state realm, and a couple of our members, Jim Burrows and Dan Segedin, are going to provide an overview of the California Cap and Trade Program as it exists now, and what's coming up. The legislature and the Air Resources Board are both looking at this, we understand. So, Jim, I'll turn this segment over to you then.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. Yeah, hey, I'm Jim Burrows. So I'm going to just hit some of the highlights of the California Cap and Trade Program. This is not a defense of the Cap and Trade Program. I'm simply going to try to explain how it's intended to work. So Martha, if you can, or somebody can pull up my first figure, figure 1. The goal of the California Air Resources Board, CARB, the goal of CARB's Cap and Trade Program is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The program is designed to reduce these emissions by annually ratcheting down the amount of greenhouse gases that in California that may be emitted by certain major sources each year. So this figure 1 shows the annual emissions cap that is set by the California Air Resources Board for annual emissions through 2031. The gray color is the annual emissions cap that is set by CARB. The blue color through 2022 are the actual emissions that are collectively emitted by the covered entities in this program. So you can see that the actual emissions have consistently been lower than the allowed emissions since the program's beginning in 2013. However, the cap and trade program allows these covered entities, their emissions of which are shown in blue here, to purchase allowances from CARB for use in later years, so-called banked credits. So use of these bank credits might alter the glide path that you see depicted here in figure 1. Might alter it for the worse in years to come. But even with the use of bank credits, GHG emissions will likely continue to decline, although perhaps not as quickly as depicted on this figure. Bank credits is an issue that CARB is reportedly considering as it contemplates new regulations that would be applicable to this program. So who are the entities that are subject to this emissions cap? Again, the entities that are depicted more or less in blue here. Well, there's 3 sectors. There's the industrial sector, industries that emit more than 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent in a year. So think a cement manufacturing plant, for example. There's the electric gas utilities. And then thirdly, there's the transportation fuel suppliers. For example, the refineries that are making gas for gas-fired cars. So how do these covered entities comply? The annual GHG emissions allowed by CARB, again depicted in gray here, are denoted as a set number of allowances. And one allowance equals 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent. So under the cap and trade program, the covered entities are required to acquire sufficient allowances to equate to their individual GHG emissions for the reporting year. So a refinery thinks it's going to emit 1,000, I'm making these numbers up, 1,000 metric tons of CO2e, carbon dioxide equivalent. It has to acquire allowances one way or the other in order to comply with their cap and trade limitations. Now, as Bob Archer mentioned quickly earlier, many of these allowances as allocated are free. Many of these allowances are free as allocated by CARB to the covered entity to cover a portion of that covered entity's expected emissions. But the remainder of the allowances are made available by CARB at quarterly auctions at a going price of approximately $30 plus per ton. So because the cost of these purchased allowances at $30 plus per ton, the covered entities have an economic incentive to reduce their GHG emissions, or at least that's the theory. So what are the results of the cap and trade program? If you can go to the next figure, Martha, figure 4. No, number two, thank you. So as figure 4 shows, greenhouse gas emissions in California have been declining since 2008, including a market decline since the beginning of the cap and trade program in 2013. However, even CARB will acknowledge that it is difficult to know exactly how much the cap and trade program has contributed to this overall decline in greenhouse gas emissions. There are, of course, other contributors to this reduction, including other state and regional and local greenhouse gas emission reduction programs, the significant adoption of the electric vehicles in the state, the temporary emissions reductions resulting from the COVID pandemic, other things, other contributors that were actually mentioned in one of Bob's slides. But nonetheless, it appears that the covered entities have been emitting fewer GHGs each year, again, as depicted on the prior figure 1. So the cap and trade program has had some effect. So Martha, you can go to the next slide. One of there's a significant amount of revenue that results from the quarterly auctions conducted by CARB of these allowance credits. And so what you see, the amount that is generated, I think in the last several years has been in the range of $3 to $4 billion, with a B, in terms of the amount that is generated from the auction of these credits. Now, as shown here on figure 5, of the quarterly auction revenues, 65% of these revenues are statutorily dedicated to certain programs. For example, funding of the high-speed rail. These dollars, these 65% of these auction revenues don't have to be appropriated on an annual basis. They're continuously appropriated, so the money comes in and it goes out to these statutorily mandated programs. That's for 65% of the revenues. For the remainder of the revenues, 35% of the revenues, those are the so-called discretionary funds that are generated as a result of these auctions. And those are subject to annual appropriations by the legislature. I've discovered that relatively well recently that most of these funds are actually these discretionary funds, the 35% of the revenues are returned to the general fund in order to balance the budget. Or put differently, return to the general fund to fund other programs that are already identified in the general fund. So that's a very quick 80,000 foot overview of the cap and trade program. And I'm going to turn over to Dan now for a quick discussion of issues and challenges.
Okay, do you want to, let's see, do you want to pause for any questions at this point for Jim, clarifications on how it works, or should we just proceed?
I have one question. I don't know whether Jim can answer this, and I put it in the chat, is that we used to hear that Tesla has made a lot of money from selling allotments over the years. And in fact, during some point in the teens, that was how they were making all their money, not from selling vehicles. And I was just kind of curious how that might have worked in the allotment scheme, that if you know.
Well, let me try to answer that question more generally. I don't know if you can put up figure 1 again, but that's the cap part of the cap and trade program. Each year there are a finite number of allowances that are allowed for greenhouse gas emissions. Now, how the players within the covered entities play with those allowances, that's in some part up to them. So some might, I'll just give you a crazy example, that some industry might have found some way to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions with, some structural reform of its industry, and yet they can still buy these allowances and then sell them at a higher price to some other industry that has not been so dedicated or fortunate or innovative enough to figure out how to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. But overall, in theory, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from all of these covered entities is capped. And the way that it gets resolved, the way that those allotments are sorted out with below that cap, whether or not somebody makes money from those allotments or not, is up to the market, basically.
Bob Archer?
I think there's another program at work, the renewable energy certificates, where Tesla has annually gotten from Detroit, the manufacturers of very few emission-free cars, had to pay in that program, transfer their certificates, buy certificates, because they didn't produce electricity. And that was like $9 billion to Tesla since 2013.
Okay, because they weren't making electric vehicles.
Right.
Okay, thank you. All right. Dan, why don't you
Okay.
take it away then?
Yeah, okay. Can we, is it Martha? Can we tee up the presentation just to the first slide? Okay, so I'm going to do three things. This is really an update. I'm going to very briefly talk on the issues with cap and trade. That's number one, but it's going to be very brief because Bob's gone over that, and the issues, you know, would be very complicated to dive into. But so I'll gloss over that. Then we're going to do an update. Since cap and trade is the game in California, we're going to do an update on proposed changes to it. There's two tracks there. One is CARB, who is using a rulemaking process to make some changes. And then kind of operating in parallel, but a little behind, is the California legislature. So we'll talk about that. So we'll do an update on that. And then this is all pretty preliminary, very preliminary, I'd say, but we'll do some advocacy implications of that. So those are the three things. So the issues, which I'm going to gloss over, an update on where we are, and then kind of some preliminary advocacy. So let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, I'm just going to, rather than talk through these points, I'm just going to say the main issue with cap and trade is complexity. There's a lot of rules to the program, and depending on how those rules are structured and how they not only interact with each other, but interact with exogenous variables that can hit the program, such as recessions, whatever. You'll notice that in the recession, we had a big drop in, carbon that probably occurred just because of the recession. But it basically leads to very unpredictable and volatile carbon pricing, and that makes it difficult for participants to plan. But I think I just leave you with one thought here. It's quite complex, all the rules, and that kind of devil in the detail makes it kind of more uncertain what you're going to get, both if you're a regulated entity and if you're an environmental organization trying to figure out how this is going to play out. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so two tracks, as I mentioned, CARB and the California legislature. So CARB's in the middle of a rulemaking process, under the APA. They've issued an October 15th, 2024 update memo. I'm going to go over that in a second. Thank you, Bell, for kind of emphasizing that we must be able to find out about what they're doing. I did finally find this memo buried on their site. And then but let me talk about the California legislature first, because that's in very early stages. This is kind of sourced from Damon Connolly's chief of staff. He said, no working group or subcommittee has been formed yet, and hearings have not been held. And he said, besides rate reduction, which is on people's minds, the objectives are not clear. So the magnitude and type of changes they might be contemplating is not clear, other than, something that might reduce rates. And reauthorization, since this expires in 2030, and without getting into it, generally, the legal opinion it requires reauthorization. It's also kind of unknown whether the legislature will simultaneously make some changes and reauthorize it beyond 2030, or just make some changes and not reauthorize it. So that's all we really know about the California legislature at this point. So I'm going to talk now. We know more about CARB because they've held, several sessions on this that were public sessions kind of in the spring and summer of 2024. And then they issued this update memo. So I'm basically going to tell you what's in the update memo. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so these are the bigger items in this memo. The next slide is going to cover small items, but this is the heart of it. So in their memo, they basically said, here's the scope of our expected amendments. And they said they want to remove 180 million allowances from 2026 to 2030. And they said they might want to eliminate up to 265 million allowances from 26 to 2045. You see those periods overlap. So if they did the first one, that's, then an additional 85 million for the remainder years, which doesn't seem like it's that much per year. They're also proposing a one-time increase in the prices of the cost containment provisions. And basically there's some provisions in this cap and trade that prevent the carbon price from going too high. This is one of those many devil in the detail rules, but basically they're proposing to raise that carbon price ceiling and also probably to raise the price of the price containment reserve, which is just another reserve that the state purchases where if you have to buy carbon in a certain year, buy an allowance, you can get it, in effect hedge and get it at this, somewhat higher price. Technicality is not important. The net result of these is that, they'd be raising the price of these allowances, basically to account for the fact that, they're shutting down a little bit the number of allowances allowed. So that should put, going down to the bottom of the slide, all else being equal, this should reduce emissions because there's fewer allowances. It should obviously increase the prices of the allowances, and it will drive more money into the greenhouse gas reduction fund. So we can, expect those effects. Now, how much is kind of a big question here. I'll just tee it up as you heard Jim allude to the banking of allowances and the fact that emissions have been below, the allowances for several years. A lot of those have been banked, and that would basically allow entities to emit above, the targeted number of allowances in the future. So you basically have a situation where there's the number of allowances allocated by the state, plus the banked allowances that could be used, minus then, this reduction. And, where that comes out net, it's not really clear now. And of course, we don't know where where CARB is actually going to set those numbers. But I'm just pointing out some of the complexity here and how, this might move. But at a high level, they're reducing the number of allowances and raising the possible ceiling prices, and that should be good. So let's go to the next slide, which I am going to gloss over because these are smaller items that they're just addressing technical issues in the program. I'll just cover like a couple of them, and then the top two. They're trying to deal with some, reduce opportunities for some market manipulation that are going on. They're also updating protocols and clarifying what needs to happen for there to be an offset. An offset, you can do up to 4% of allowances, so this is not a big deal. You can do an offset project in certain areas that meet certain criteria, et cetera. And they're, I think, trying to make it a little tougher here to get to do these offset projects. A lot of environmentalists, I think, have been concerned about these offset projects, that they're not permanent, they're not additional. And, I think some of that is making its way in here, or it could be more technical changes to protocol. So let me now move to the last slide. Thank you. So in terms of advocacy here, both with CARB and then with the legislature, one obvious, high level thing is to just what's called increase the stringency of the program, basically to try and drive the price of the carbon offset, the allocation, closer to its societal cost. The federal government came out with something recently I saw that had the societal cost of like $190. Current prices in the market are around 30 to 40. So there's a big gap there in terms of pricing the externality. So you could try and make this program through various changes to all those detailed rules, but the fundamentals of which would involve reducing the number of allowances and essentially reducing the cap and making less of the allowances free, so that there be, and then making there be, could be a higher price floor, higher price ceiling, etc. So, but broadly stringency and making the program basically stricter. And that would manifest as saying, well, you're trying to reduce however many allowances we showed on the slides before. Actually, we should try and get this many, a bigger reduction, whatever it is. And then, as we mentioned, the GGRF, which is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which Jim covered, the question becomes, if they do, through these changes, drive up the carbon price, they're going to get more money at auctions, and there'll be more in this GGRF. And so then the question is, well, where is that going to go? It could go to electric rate reduction. Currently, it goes to a lot of electric on-bill rebates. But I think, CCL would say, and I don't want to represent them here, but I'm sure Bob could, that, it's better to have the reduction in rates, because then when someone's making a decision about a carbon lowering technology, they see more of the benefit and it makes the economics better. But right now it's kind of an on-bill rebate that kind of, doesn't have a lot of visibility. You could also have more programs or more funding for the current programs. You saw a lot of this, you saw a slide with a pie chart. Well, you saw where some of this money is going in one of the charts. So the whole issue of where does this money go in the GGRF, the incremental money, and then if you want to challenge where the base money is going that's already there, you could do that too. And then maybe there's other things here, but that is the heart of it. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over just say, hey, we're in early phases here. CARB is ahead. We'll see what they're going to do. We could engage that process. And then the legislative process, which presumably will be acting in conjunction with CARB's changes, at least they say they will, is the next process, but that really hasn't begun yet. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Ken or Bob.
Yeah, I would just add that we had a discussion with Damon Connolly about, first of all, Bob and I were able to participate in one with the Citizens Climate Lobby scheduled with Damon, where they put on a pretty good presentation about how electric rate reduction could be supported by changes in the cap and trade program and the use of the greenhouse reduction funds. But Damon seems very interested in this issue this year, about some sort of reform to the cap and trade system, and particularly if it will support electric rate reform. So that's a little bit of background on kind of what's going on now. How much this makes sense after we heard Bob Archer's talk earlier, where we got to go with this, I guess stay tuned. But and we're going to probably advocate. If it moves forward, we'd like to see some electric rate reform, more money go to electric rate reform. So.
Question.
Yeah, Bob.
In mid-November, the governor issued an executive order ordering the major agencies to report on where they could reduce costs of electricity and energy for consumers in their programs. And that was due January 1st. If possible, I think we should try to follow up and find out what is in that.
Assuming that they've issued their reports, because it's been crickets.
I mean, that's 6 weeks is not a serious period of time over the holidays to come up with programs, but it'd be interesting to see what the indications are. But I come back to what I've mentioned before, is the need for evaluation of the programs, as the legislative analyst office, and then Jim mentioned that they don't know how much cap and trade contributes. So how do you get some independent look at what that is and how much is actually due to the electricity programs of the setting standards and the federal 30% tax credits, etc. There needs to be, I think, something on this. Cap and trade is important, but it's only supposed to account for about 20 to 25% of emission reductions. There's a whole other 70% out there, and that's based upon the scoping.
Yeah, it's a difficult issue, and I don't think they know. And the primary issue is there's all these other programs, and then there's all these other developments. There's RPS, of course. That's one of the main programs in the state. You got the low carbon fuel standard, LCFS. You got the zero emission vehicle. So you got a bunch of public policies that are all interacting. And then on top of that, you kind of have, well, how much is the economy growing? How much did it grow over that period? What would you have expected? So, it's complicated. I don't think they're going to come up with some clean answer to that, frankly. I think they're going to just focus on rate reduction and move it from there. One can hope, but it's very hard to tell. There's a lot of variables to control for, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, the greenhouse gas reduction fund is something else that requires more evaluation. I think something that we already know is that there are a number of mandated proportions of the fund that wind up doing things that don't reduce greenhouse gas by very much. It's really disappointing to see some of those funds just wasted. High-speed rail is sort of a classic example. The large now Central Valley project, but there are other places where the money is being spent where it could be spent better, and it may be a very heavy lift, given that there are entrenched interests that are getting money to change that, but it certainly is something that needs to be looked at. And the question has to be asked, if you were to do this from scratch and you really wanted to reduce greenhouse gases, what would you do?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And just to support what Bob has just gone through, I saw in one of the reports somewhere that the cost, of these various GGRF programs, the cost per metric ton reduced was very high. And in some programs, it was kind of ridiculous, like 150,000 per metric ton or something. So some of them, at least on the surface, maybe they weren't at scale, maybe there's other explanations, but seemed to be incredibly inefficient. And all of them were at quite high cost per ton of carbon reduced. So it does beg, Bob's question, I think, is on point regarding that. It's, if you were looking at this from the start, would you really, do all this, and does all this make sense?
Bill, Carney?
Which one? Yeah, just following up on the concept of utilizing these funds to reduce electricity rates. I wonder how that can be really clear to the consumers that this is, this is being done. It kind of goes to the educational thing that Bob was mentioning previously. And related point would be, is there a way not only of just blanket, reducing electricity rates, which is clearly of value for what we're trying to accomplish of getting people to electrify, but tying it more directly also to other things that the state is doing on a regulatory level to get people to adopt electric appliances and HVAC and EVs for that matter, because the state has these sort of mandates about not selling EVs after 2035. It's about to have some code incentives going through localities to only use heat pumps going forward, only use electric heat pumps going forward on HVAC and on water heaters, etc. So those are real initiatives that are out there. Can we tie some money to those so that for the customers, it's even a greater incentive to adopt those technologies?
and prevent the CPUC from authorizing additional rate increases to offset these rate reductions we're asking. So, but, Bell?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask,
Talk to the.
oh, I just wanted to ask, both Dan and, Jim. So how do you see the sort of the advocacy priorities of MCL as a result of what you've been talking about? I mean, we had a plan and we've been advocating about all the issues that have been brought up. We haven't done much on dealing with fossil fuel increase or dealing with curbing fossil fuel development. We haven't done that. Maybe that's reasonable here. I'm not sure, but so I just wondered what you thought the priorities ought to be as a result of looking at where CARB is going and also just understanding better how cap and trade works.
Well, Bill, are you asking the question kind of narrowly, like where should the priorities be in terms of reforming the cap and trade? Or are you saying more broadly, you know, considering all our priorities, where should we be focusing? I probably can't answer that latter one.
No, I was saying the former.
Yeah. Well, I'll take a cut, and I'm sure Jim has a cut on this too. I mean, I don't know how well we can influence CARB. They are down the road a bit. The legislator, you know, MCL has traditionally had access to people like Damon and so on. So I think we could get in his ear. And I think the two main prongs there are, you know, increasing the stringency of the program and then using some of that increased stringency, which will then generate money to then have, you know, programs that money could then go into. So at a very simple level, that's kind of my take on it. I don't know if Jim has a take.
Well, process-wise, just let's say three things. With regard to the CARB's regulatory rulemaking, it is a rulemaking. So there will be an opportunity for the public, MCL and whomever, to submit comments. And I'm just making this up, we could submit a comment, for example, that maximum number of allowances should be removed in the next 4 years and in the next 15 years. I mean, that's one thing that MCL could do. Is to participate in the rulemaking process. With regard to the use of the GGRF funds, which a couple of people have already spoken to, as Bob says, of course, there's the 65% that are statutorily required, meaning that can only be changed with legislation, and that would be working with the Assembly and the Senate in terms of modifying the targeted expenditures that are required statutorily. Remove it, you know, high-speed rail, whatever the ultimate position is. So to participate in the legislative bill process with regard to the statutory use of those EGRF funds. And then the third way to do it is the old-fashioned way of with regard to the discretionary funds that have to be appropriated each year, is to participate in the appropriations committee process in terms of where should these 35% of the GGRF revenues go to. Now we'd be fighting perhaps Governor Newsom and, you know, like he did last year and the year before, proposing that most of these funds be returned to the general fund in order that we have a balanced budget. But we, along with everybody else who has, you know, a stake in how these funds are being used, the forum there, of course, is the appropriation process. So in terms of MCL's involvement, regulatory with CARB or legislatively with the legislature or the appropriations committees.
Well, we're gonna have to draw this to a close, but Bob, you have a short comment?
Yes, I raised this issue at the last MCL breakfast with Damon about his holding cap and trade hearings before the Joint Legislative Committee on the Climate Crisis, and he's co-chair.
He's not.
He's not this time around?
No,
Okay.
he had hoped to be the chair or the co-chair. but he is not. So he believes he's going to be on the committee, but he's not a co-chair.
I think we should look at trying to get hearings held
Yeah.
by that group to give greater profile outside the CARB rigid process.
That might be something that Mike McGuire can help us with.
Yes.
Yeah, so this has been, I mean, in my view, this has been a really excellent discussion. Thank you, Bob, for your presentation. And also Jim and Dan. There's just been a lot here, and it's a tribute to the three of you that the presentations were so good. What we're going to do now is to have a minute or two from organizations that have representatives still here, to say what's coming up with them, and but first, why don't we talk about what's coming up for the next meeting?
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, our COG meeting on February 19th, we're going to have as our guests three of the staff members of recently, who in the last year or two have come on board at various local towns. They're the sustainability staff members. It's going to be Phoebe Golden from Corte Madera, Bridget Whipfler for Fairfax and San Anselmo, and Grace Ledwith for Mill Valley and Tiburon. And we're going to get to know them, find out about their what their goals are for this coming year, how they work together, how they work with within their towns, and also with the county, et cetera, to further climate policies. So that's next month.
Okay, so a lightning round of announcements, starting off with you, Jody.
For 350. Okay, well, the main thing that we have, let's talk here, coming up is this event that the Fairfax and the San Anselmo Climate Action Committee and Commissions is putting together, that 350 is supporting, as well as all the sustainables and Ride and Drive Clean. So I just want to mention it for those who haven't heard about it. February 7th at the Women's Club in Fairfax. Doors open at 7 for socializing, tabling. There'll be some plastic art projects going on, and just checking in with each other. Then Damon Connolly will be there for a discussion, just a bit of an update on what's happening at the state level. And then in conversation with 4 high school students. So many of us are always trying to get youth involved. So we want to come out and support the youth when they show up, which we're hoping we'll have more folks who can ask Damon some questions. And then these 2 artists. So we're trying to have events that are attractive, not just for political information and education, but also artistic. So Richard and Judith Selby Lang, who are West Marin artists in World of Plastic, they collect pieces of plastic from the beach. They're going to be there talking about their work, and you can come and make a art piece with their plastic pieces. They're going to bring boxes of different things, so you can produce an event, take a photograph, and then put the plastic back in their boxes. And then Renee Goddard will do a short presentation on marine sanitary service and waste management, recycling, etc. So that event's happening. I brought a few extra flyers if people would like to take one, and if you post it somewhere. Otherwise, we're trying to just publicize this and get a good turnout for this. The first time these two climate action committees and commissions are jointly putting on an event, other than our car shows, which we're doing again in May. This one will be at Red Hill.
What's the time? What's the time?
For this event? Starts at 7. Well, the doors open at 7 for that social. PM, generally PM. Then the program starts at 7:30, Damon, and it will run until 8:45. So
Thank you so much, Jody.
thank you.
All right, Bill.
Yeah, quickly, so tomorrow at 4 o'clock at Samerfeld City Hall upstairs is the Climate Change Action Plan Implementation Forum. So open public forum for all who want to bring their ideas to how to implement that plan. There also are a couple of speakers associated with that. The president of College of Marin is going to be speaking. Also, Renee Goddard actually will be speaking on behalf of the San Rafael Chamber of Commerce. And there'll be a contingent of students there also from the Marin School of Environmental Leadership. So it should be an interesting, hour and a half. So please come on out, 4 o'clock tomorrow, San Rafael City Hall.
Thanks. Bill?
Yeah, the next day, Friday, the 17th, January 17th, the MWPA and ESP are hosting a field trip. And it's a field trip. The Southern Marin Fire District is involved too. And the subject is, it's going to view the Ring Mountain fuel break in southern Mill Valley. And if you haven't heard about it, if you don't have the details, we can get them to you, because it should be it's the first time we had one in this area. And I think it should be really interesting. A lot of good discussion about what we're seeing. And so what's the best way to get this to people? Should we put it in the, I don't know, I could just email it to people.
Or people could email you, give them your email and they can email you for the information.
Oh, I could give them, yeah. A bell call at Comcast.net. Just send it to me and I'll send you the stuff. Thanks a lot.
Okay. So, any further announcements?
I'll just quickly mention there is a People's March, that, big one in Washington, DC on Saturday. It's also going to be one in San Francisco. And there's also a bit of a rally in San Rafael at the, that by the bank.
I actually have got one. So tonight, for those who live in Larkspur, tonight, the Larkspur City Council is going to have the first report on the status, et cetera, of its climate action plan, which it passed 3.5 years ago and has not had a report on in 3.5 years. So Larkspur residents either tune in by Zoom or show up in person. It's at the city council chambers in Larkspur. At David, is it 6 or 6:30 or 7?
6:30. Probably that I don't come up about 7. The other thing at that meeting tonight is Larkspur is considering forming a formal climate committee or commission to advise the council on climate matters, as many other jurisdictions here in Marin have adopted. So that's a pretty big deal. Generally, Larkspur has been a laggard on climate issues. So both this first report out on status of implementation of the climate action plan and consideration of forming a formal climate committee are really big deals, and a direct result both of community input and the election of 2 climate champions to the city council.
Great. So are there any other announcements? Seeing none. This is it. We'll draw this to a close. See you folks on February 19th, 10 a.m. next Climate Action Working Group meeting.